Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Now, recently I took 3 Intel 10th Gen Core Series processors and compared their core scaling performance, revealing that in today's games, most of the performance gains you see when going from a Core i5 10600K to a Core i7 10700K or even the Core i9 10900K are largely due to the increased L3 cache capacity. This was an interesting investigation because most people who upgrade from an older generation Intel processor such as the Core i7 8700K to newer parts such as the Core i9 10900K, and they see a strong performance uplift in games when doing this, they almost always believe it's a result of the 67% increase in cores. But for the most part, it's actually due to the 67% increase in L3 cache capacity. At least that is the case in today's most demanding games. Coming away from that testing, a good many of you wanted to know how much difference the L3 cache capacity would make with just 4 cores active. I guess you're wondering if the margins would be even greater than what we saw with 6 cores. So I've gone back and retested a 4-core, 8-thread configuration while adding 3 more games to the list, and I've also added a 4th processor, the 4-core, 8-thread Core i3 10105F or the 10105F, the 10105F, Not sure what we're going to go with. A bit of a mouthful, that one, but yeah, that's the one we're using. Now, because the Core i3 processors are locked, I'm unable to adjust the frequency to 4.5 GHz, and instead the 10105F ran at 4.2 GHz in all of our tests, as this is the all-core frequency for this particular part, and that means it's clocked 7% lower than that of the K-SKU parts. Unfortunately, this was the only Core i3 model that I was able to purchase in time for making this video. The Core i3 10325 would have been more suitable, as I believe that part can sustain a 4.5 GHz all-core frequency, but yeah, sadly I wasn't able to find it anywhere. So be aware the Core i3 part is running at a clock speed disadvantage, but it's likely going to be a really interesting addition all the same, given that it has a much more limited 6MB L3 cache. It's also worth noting that the fastest quad-core CPU that Intel has produced to date is the Core i7 7700K, or one of the higher clocked Comet Lake Core i3s, such as the Core i3 10325, both of which feature an 8MB L3 cache, so 2MB more than the 10105F. So, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of gains will be possible using a quad-core CPU with 20MB of L3 cache, something that we can achieve with the 10900K by disabling half a dozen cores on that part. Again, for this testing, I used the Gigabyte Z590 Aorus Extreme motherboard. I then clocked the 3 K-SKU CPUs at 4.5 GHz with a 45 times multiplier for the ring bus, and used DDR4 3200CL14 dual-rank dual-channel memory with all the primary, secondary, and tertiary timings manually configured. The Core i3 10105F used the same spec memory, but I was unable to adjust the clock frequency. Finally, the bulk of the testing was conducted using the Radeon RX 6900 XT, as it's currently the fastest 1080p gaming graphics card on the market, but I've also included a few results using the RTX 3090 for a look at Nvidia's added overhead, which I suspect will affect the quad-core configurations. Okay, let's go check out the results. We'll start with Rainbow Six Siege, as previously this was the title that saw the most significant performance differences when comparing the various cache capacities. For example, with all CPUs locked to 6 cores, we saw a massive 18% increase from 12MB to 20MB of L3 cache. Now with just 4 cores enabled, the margin from the 10600K to the 10900K actually reduced to 13%, so quite a bit less than the margin seen with 6 cores enabled. So it would appear as though the larger L3 cache becomes less effective at boosting performance with fewer cores to utilize it. This is perhaps best illustrated by the Core i3 part, which was just 9% slower than the 10600K, and remember it is clocked 7% lower, so presumably at least half of that margin is down to the difference in clock speed. Still, it is interesting to note that it was possible to improve performance from the 4-core Core i3 by 24% when using the Core i9 10900K with just 4 cores active. That really is a massive increase given that both CPUs use the same Comet Lake architecture, with the only difference being a 7% clock frequency variation, and of course the L3 cache capacity, which is over 3 times larger for the Core i9 part. So the takeaway here being that not all cores are equal, even if the cores themselves are physically the same. A difference in cache capacity can make all the difference in the world. That and cramming more cache into a CPU with just 4 cores active is still beneficial, but it's less efficient than what we saw with 6 cores. In fact, it seems like the sweet spot for Comet Lake might be around 20 megabytes for 6 cores, meaning the 10900K would likely work quite a bit better with around 32 megabytes of L3 cache. But of course, that would make for an absolutely massive die. Next up, we have Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which is a heavily GPU-bound title, especially when using the ultra-high quality preset, even with a Radeon RX 1600 XT at 1080p. As a result, the benchmark numbers are heavily GPU bound, and it's really only the Core i3 model that sees a very small dip in 1% low performance, suggesting that the frame time performance isn't quite as good with the 6MB L3 cache, but also not significantly worse either. A new addition to this testing is Battlefield 5, and here we see that the 20MB L3 cache of the 10900K is very beneficial, even when limited to 6 cores. That said, dialing down to 4 cores creates a CPU bottleneck that we can't simply solve with more cache. 1% low performance was improved by 9% when going from 16 to 20 megabytes, which isn't nothing, but it's less than the 13% gain we saw with 6 cores enabled. Then with just 4 cores enabled, the 10900K was comparable to the stock 10600K. In fact, the frame time performance was actually slightly better, improving 1% lows by a 12% margin. In fact, when it came to 1% low performance, the 10105F did struggle quite a bit, dipping down to 71 FPS, making it 19% slower than the 10600K and a massive 30% slower than the 10900K. Again, that's quite an incredible difference that's almost entirely down to the difference in L3 cache capacity. The F1 2020 results are interesting and quite similar to what we've seen previously, where the L3 cache capacity made more of a difference with 6 cores, though we do see some difference with just 4 cores active. That said, the 10700K was just 3% slower than the 10900K, while the 10600K was a further 3% slower than the 10700K. So pretty consistent scaling there. The Core i3 part though, it was 8% slower than the 10600K, or 11% slower if we look at the 1% low results. Again, I'd estimate that at most 5% of that margin could be due to the difference in clock speed, so if that is the case, scaling is still roughly in line with what we saw with the K-SKU parts. Hitman's quite a CPU intensive title, and we did see a 9% increase in performance when going from 12 to 20 megabytes of L3 cache with 6 cores enabled. That margin was reduced with just 4 cores enabled, this time to 6%. Then we saw a 9% drop in performance from the 10600K to the Core i3 part. Horizon Zero Dawn is a lot like Assassin's Creed Valhalla in the sense that it's primarily a GPU-bound title, even at 1080p with a 1600 XT. As a result, the 4-core configurations weren't a great deal slower than what we saw with 6, 8, and 10 cores enabled. The Core i3 part also performed very well relative to the higher-end Core i5, i7, and i9 models. Cyberpunk 2077 is a very CPU-intensive game, and you'll see a huge benefit when upgrading to a modern 6-core processor, such as the Core i5 10600K. That said, had the 10600K been armed with a 20MB L3 cache, it would be 13% faster in this title when looking at the 1% low performance. That margin remained fairly consistent with just 4 cores enabled, as the 10900K configuration was 12% faster than the 10600K. Interestingly, the 4-core 10600K configuration was just 6% faster than the Core i3 on average, but 19% faster when comparing the 1% low performance, and this is where the Core i3 really struggled with just 64 FPS. When looking closely at the Core i3 part, we see a massive 56% performance disparity between the 1% low and average frame rate, whereas the 10600K sees a 39% margin, and this suggests much more consistent frame time performance. It's worth noting that the 10900K with just 4 cores active did play very well, offering smooth and consistent performance, despite being 25% slower than its 6, 8, and 10 core configurations. The Core i3 though did suffer from noticeable stuttering, and again, this was reflected in the much weaker 1% low performance. So while a 10th gen quad core with a fat L3 cache can play the game just fine, it is still much slower than a 6-core equivalent, while going to 8 cores offers you no improvement in average frame rate performance or frame time performance. Next up we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is another very CPU demanding game, but again, with just 4 cores enabled, the 10th gen CPUs aren't able to take advantage of the extra L3 cache like they are with 6 cores. It's not until the L3 cache is reduced to just 6 megabytes with the Core i3 part that the performance does start to fall away, dropping the 1% low performance by 16% when compared to the 10600K. Now, as I was wrapping up the quad-core testing, I thought it might be interesting to rerun a few of these tests using the GeForce RTX 3090. So I did that, and here are the Shadow of the Tomb Raider results. Quite interestingly, with 6 cores enabled, the 10600K was 13% slower than the 10900K when using the Radeon GPU, but now it's 15% slower. So not a huge change there. However, with 4 cores enabled, the 10600K was just 4% slower than the 10900K with the Radeon GPU. But now with the RTX 3090, we're looking at radically different 4-core results. Here, the 10600K is now 14% slower than the 10900K when looking at the average frame rate, and 13% slower for the 1% low. And this is a result of NVIDIA's added overhead by using the CPU for much of its GPU scheduling. However, it's the Core i3 part that this software scheduling really cripples, tanking the 1% low performance to just 54 FPS, making it 28% slower than the 10600K, whereas previously it was 16% slower. So had I used the RTX 3090, the 4-core results in titles such as Hitman, Cyberpunk 2077, Battlefield 5, and so on might have been much more significant. Last up, we have Watch Dogs Legion, and these results were reported using the 6900 XT, but I also retested the game using the RTX 3090, and we'll get to those results in a moment. Previously, we didn't see much of a difference with the K-SKU parts. With 6 cores enabled, the results were much the same, and then 8 cores only offered a very small performance boost. However, 4 cores does drop performance quite considerably. The 10600K, for example, was 17% slower with just 4 cores enabled, and we saw similar margins with the 10700K and 10900K. That said, performance between the various 4-core configurations is fairly similar, and even the Core i3 part manages to hang in there. Quite interestingly, using the RTX 3090 doesn't do too much to the 4-core results. Here the 10600K was 19% slower with just 4 cores enabled when compared to its stock 6-core configuration. Quite unexpectedly though, the margins with 6 and 8 cores enabled are quite different, and it seems that the cache plays a larger role with the RTX 3090 installed, presumably because the CPU is having to do more work. It's also interesting how we don't see the same scaling with just 4 cores enabled, but it does appear as though this is too few cores to take advantage of the increased L3 cache capacity. Well, that was certainly interesting, but probably not what a lot of you who requested this testing were expecting. I think the expectation was that with fewer cores, the larger L3 cache of the 10900K would play an even greater role, but for the most part that doesn't appear to be the case. It's clear for mid-range to high-end gaming that quad cores are out, but that won't be news to any of you. We've known this for quite some time now, which is why AMD and Intel have stopped producing mid-range quad-core processors. That said, for lower-end systems, quad-cores still work really well, though I should clarify that by saying 4-core 8-thread processors, so simultaneous multi-threading support really is a must. Frame time performance can hurt in demanding titles such as Battlefield 5, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and Cyberpunk 2077, for example. But in most games, if you're using a lower tier graphics card, such as a Radeon RX 5500 XT, GeForce GTX 1650 Super, or anything slower, a decent quad-core will enable an acceptable level of performance. Also, frame capping to, let's say, 60 FPS can really help smooth out frame rates in titles such as Cyberpunk 2077, as it does reduce CPU load as well as frame-to-frame variance. So if you're running into stuttering issues, try capping the frame rate to something more sustainable, as that can help. Of course, if you want more frames, that's not exactly an ideal solution, and in that case, you really will be forced to upgrade. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. I'll be back shortly with a few more GPU revisits, amongst other things, so stay tuned. If you liked this video, you know what to do. You can also subscribe for more content, and if you'd like to get more involved with the Hardware Unboxed channel and get some pretty awesome perks in return, then check us out on Floatplane or Patreon. The links for those in the video description. You get access to our exclusive Discord server where Tim and myself chat with you guys. We have a really cool community there. Great place to talk about tech. We also have a monthly live stream that Tim and I do for the Floatplane and Patreon members. Q&As, behind the scenes content, a lot of cool stuff there. I'm also building a new studio at the moment, and all that behind the scenes content is going to the Patreon and Floatplane members. So yeah, but if you're not interested in any of that, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host Steve, and I'll see you again next time.